Shabbat Shalom. Of all of the virtues, of all of the take-home messages to be gotten from the Genesis story of creation, perhaps the most obvious and the most overlooked came by way of one of the final articles shared with me by my doctoral advisor, Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr, who died in Jerusalem this past week at the age of 83. For those of you who might not know, after rabbinical school, I studied at the University of Chicago, eventually receiving a PhD from the Divinity School. In German, one's thesis advisor is called a Doktorvater, literally the father of your doctorate, a title that signals a well-nigh paternal role a faculty supervisor plays in bringing a student's thesis to life. Paul Mendes-Flohr was mine. While I was not his first, final, or finest student, Paul's personal, intellectual, and spiritual mentorship shaped me into the rabbi, erstwhile aspiring scholar, and person that I am today. Paul's stamp of approval is on my thesis, but he really did so much more than that. He left his imprimatur on my very being, teaching me how to think, write, and most of all, believe in myself. In the weeks, months, and years to come, I'm sure there will be no shortage of tributes, symposia, and festschrifts in Paul's honor. In light of his passing, I've decided to dedicate my Tuesday post-Minyan class to his memory, a year devoted to exploring his writing and thought. It begins this week. You're all invited in person or online. Paul was his generation's preeminent scholar of modern Jewish thought, an authority on Martin Buber, on Franz Rosenzweig, on Gershom Scholem, on Leo Strauss, and so many others. His writing probed the disorienting perplexities of the modern Jewish condition. He asked the big questions: how to balance our secular and religious identities, our particular and our universal commitments, the ongoing challenges of the Enlightenment and the Emancipation, the condition of Jewish belief in the shadow of the Holocaust, the balancing act of Zionism and diaspora Jewish identity, and the dream of Jewish sovereignty with a Palestinian aspiration for the same, and so much more. Paul spent most of his career on faculty at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and then an appointment at University of Chicago, where I studied with him. His essays, books, and anthologies are quite literally required reading in any course in modern Jewish thought, and his students occupy positions of academic leadership in Jewish studies departments across the globe. For me, it's a badge of honor to be known as one of Paul's students, and I did my best to keep the relationship going long after I finished up in Chicago. Whenever I visited Jerusalem, as I did this past summer, I always made a point to see Paul, catch up on family, and most of all, speak of our love and shared concern for the Jewish people. He would tell me what he was working on, and by the time I arrived back at my computer, he had already emailed me copies of his most recent lectures, essays, and outlines. One of the final documents Paul sent to me, and here we return to this morning's Torah reading, were notes he recently presented at a lecture at a Danish academic conference on the subject of the critically important and oft-overlooked virtue of hospitality. The lecture begins with an epigraph from the Austrian Jewish novelist Joseph Roth, stating, "Hospitality is among the noblest proofs of humanity." And it takes its cue from the biblical scene of the biblical patriarch Abraham sitting in the heat of the day at the entrance of his tent. As God appeared to Abraham, 3 travelers approached, and Abraham jumped to his feet to greet them, washed their tired feet, and together with Sarah, fed them. Noting Abraham's exemplary behavior, the rabbis of old conclude that the act of welcoming the stranger, hospitality, what in Hebrew is called hachnasat orchim, is a deed akin to, if not greater, than welcoming the divine presence itself. Paul's lecture, which reads as much as a spiritual meditation as it does an academic paper, surveys the rituals, liturgies, and literatures of various traditions on the importance of welcoming strangers. As Jews, for instance, we begin our Passover Seder with halach ma'anya, welcoming all those in need of a place. Polish nobility, not unlike Jews, received guests with bread and salt, literally breaking bread, as do Russians, an act of hospitality that actually takes its cue from the Christian textual tradition. The Koine Greek term for hospitality is philoxenia, denoting affection, philos, for the stranger, xenos. Paul set out a hierarchy of hospitality, the highest rung being hospitality extended not just to family and friends, those whom we share ethnicity, ideology, faith, and station in life, but those with whom we do not. As the philosopher Kant stipulated, hospitality to the stranger is the essential condition for the attainment of universal fraternity and eternal peace. In Paul's words, quote, Abraham's solicitous hospitality to the stranger exemplified agapic love, a hospitality of the heart that supersedes the constraints of one's symbolic culture and borders that divide the human family. It's all pretty heady stuff. And yes, to be Paul's student meant that you always had to keep a thesaurus nearby. His felicitous prose served to raise up both his ideas and his reader. But on this morning of Shabbat Breshit, we know that Paul's reflections on the importance of hospitality are rooted in the opening chapters of the Genesis story. The creation story can be read in so many different ways. A tale of cosmic beginnings, a comment on the infinite dignity of a humanity created in the image of God, or a meditation on human agency and moral conduct. The creation is all those things, but at its essence, it's a story of welcoming, of hachnasat orchim. In 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth, and the story could have ended there, and some ancient Near Eastern creation stories do. But that's not what happens in the Torah. The final act of creation describes God inviting humanity to fill the earth, and then, as Genesis chapter 2 explains, to till and tend that earth. The Garden of Eden itself is a symbol of divine hospitality, sustenance, and abundance, and most of all, welcoming. There are responsibilities and rules. This story we know will have its ups and downs, but at its simplest and sacred core, the story of Genesis is a tale of hospitality, a celestial host who chooses to open up the divine abode to those seeking entry. By a certain telling, the unfolding story of humanity to this very day tracks our behavior as guests on this earth, and the degree to which we ourselves extend that reflex of hospitality towards others. And once named, this thread of hospitality woven into the biblical narrative can be seen everywhere, in its fulfillment and in its breach. There is, as noted, the hospitality of Abraham and Sarah. There's a hospitality extended by Abraham's nephew to the angels in the wicked city of Sodom. There's Rebekah, who generously offers the water to the camels of Abraham's servant at the well. There's Jethro, who provides hospitality to his future son-in-law Moses, who had fled from the house of Pharaoh. Show me a biblical hero, and I'll show you the mitzvah of hachnasat orchim, of hospitality. Show me a biblical anti-hero, and I'll show you the opposite, be it the wicked residents of Sodom, Laban's change of heart for his son-in-law Jacob, Jacob's sons selling their brother Joseph into slavery, or, of course, Pharaoh's inability to countenance the children of Israel in Egypt. from the garden itself to Noah's Ark onboarding animals 2 by 2, to Rachav offering shelter to the Israelite spies, the virtue of hospitality is a biblical litmus test for nobility. And it's a mitzvah, a commandment, that's not just about physical welcoming, offering a person a place to sleep or a meal to eat, but it's a spiritual welcoming, a hospitality of the heart. In our own psychosocial and spiritual spheres, to be hospitable means to make room for people different than us, ideas unlike our own, and needs and priorities that may not be ours. Abraham was able to welcome the stranger, a bar to which we should all aspire, but we all need to welcome the strange, the different, and the dissimilar. A spiritual posture capable of expressing sympathy and empathy for another human being. A willingness to allow the membrane of our spiritual shells to be sufficiently porous and capacious to include the concerns of another, even and especially when that person's needs are different from our own. A magnanimous hospitality of the heart, the highest expression of spiritual grandeur. Perhaps more than any other subject about whom Paul wrote, he was drawn to the towering figure of Martin Buber, a scholarly devotion that undoubtedly said as much about Paul as it did about Buber. I still remember where I was when Paul shared with me the story of how Martin Buber became Martin Buber. It was the summer of 1914 when a young man sought Buber out, as many did then, for his counsel. A kind man, Buber greeted the youth, entertained his questions, and ended the meeting without incident. In the following weeks, Buber learned that the young man's visit had been anything but casual. He had visited, in Buber's words, not for a chat, but for a decision. And Buber discovered soon after that meeting that the young man had tragically taken his own life. Shaken to his core, Buber chastised himself for not having seen the young man's loneliness, for having failed to make room for the anxious soul before him and provide welcome. Buber underwent what he called a conversion. No longer was the religious experience to be defined by extraction, exaltation, and ecstasy. Buber understood that the greatest religious deed one can perform is to open oneself to another in true dialogue. He went on to write I and Thou, one of the greatest theological meditations of all time, in which he contends, amongst other things, that all real living is meeting. And it's this line of spiritual hospitality that begins in the Garden of Eden, through the Bible, through rabbinic literature, through Buber, by which the passions and priorities of Paul can be understood. In more essays and conversations that I can count, Paul was fond of quoting the Robert Frost poem, Mending Wall, a poem which you may remember from high school that begins with the speaker exclaiming, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall. Walls used to wall things in, walls used to wall things out, be it animals across a property line, a carton of eggs shared between roommates, or people or ideas seeking to coexist in a world that is disinclined to make room for others." It was a theme intertwined in Paul's scholarship, the stories he told, the poems he quoted, and most of all, the manner by which he lived. Devoted Zionist as Paul was, he held a lifelong commitment for shared Arab-Jewish coexistence, that if we could somehow spend less time putting up walls and making more space for each other, listening to each other's claims and counterclaims with a spirit of respectful dialogue, maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to share this world. And finally, I would be remiss if I failed to point out that the spirit of welcoming characterized not just Paul's scholarship and politics, but it's how he lived in the rough-edged and often inhospitable world of academia. In a tough moment of my own scholarly development, when more doors were closing than opening, Paul offered me a warm refuge. He took a chance on me and welcomed me as another student to supervise, an act of hachnasat orchim, of welcoming, for which I am ever indebted and seek to pay forward every day of my life. I met with Paul this summer as our schedules permitted, but the last time I saw him this summer, and now forever, was unplanned. I was walking through the streets of Jerusalem en route to my summer fellowship when I came across Paul sitting on a bench on the corner of Hasfira and Klein Streets. He was waiting for his ride to take him to a doctor's appointment. Ever a Shaner Yid, he shimmied over, made room for me, invited me to sit next to him, and proceeded to ask me about Debbie, the kids, and how my writing was going. We sat together that day on the bench, kibitzing, minutes with the feel of eternity, until his ride arrived, and I helped him into his car, and we waved goodbye to each other. I grieve for the loss of my teacher, mentor, and friend, but if I had to pick a parting image to comfort me, I can't pick a better one. We all need to learn to shimmy over, physically and spiritually, and make room for one another. There's always space to welcome and be in dialogue. It's a divine bar towards which we aspire since the beginning, the very, very beginning. A spirit, a heart of hospitality that will contribute towards bridging the divisions of our time and bringing healing to our broken world, and in so doing, ensure that the life and legacy of my teacher, Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr, ever be for a blessing. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining the Park Avenue Synagogue family. I hope you enjoyed the sermon. Please consider supporting our online community by scanning the QR code or by going to supportpas.org or by making a donation. Shalom, and see you in Shul.